My name is Bob. I did my first paying gig in 1967. I've been gigging steadily pretty much every weekend since then. I was never good enough to make the kind of living I needed to make to raise a family playing the guitar, but I've done all right. I've owned many vintage instruments. I still own a few, and I've played a lot more. I've worked in a music store, so I've been around, and I think I have some credibility when it comes to talking about vintage guitars. And we're talking electric guitars here. I'm not an expert on acoustic guitars, but for me, vintage guitars are guitars from the 50s and the 60s, period. I'll explain why later if I remember. In general, yes, and sometimes in a spectacular way. There's just something about the way the sound jumps off a vintage guitar. The sound just literally jumps out of them. Another thing I noticed, that the pots are very easy to turn on vintage guitars for some reason. Maybe because the wiper in the middle is worn down. There is a magic about them. And again, sometimes it's spectacular. Two best guitars I ever played were vintage guitars. My buddy Paul and I went to New York Music, which oddly enough is located in Youngstown, Ohio. And when we got there, our friend that worked there came out of the back room with a brown form-fit case. And in that case was a very faded 1959 Les Paul Burst. Now, I played Burst before. I had a friend that actually owned two of them. I believe a 59 and a 60. One of them he either sold or bought from Joe Perry of Aerosmith. I can't remember exactly. But I played both of those guitars on occasion. They were very nice guitars. So I took this guitar at New York Music out of the case, and the first thing I noticed about it was how light it was. Okay. Tuned it up and strummed, I don't know, probably a G chord. And Paul and I just looked at each other, the way the sound just jumped off of that guitar. We hadn't even plugged it in yet. So we got to play that guitar for about an hour, and it was incredible. It had cleans like a Telecaster, and yet it would growl. I think we had it plugged into one of those old Master Volume 50-watt Marshalls. My memory is that was probably the best guitar I ever played in my life, the best sounding guitar. But it was already sold for the price of $4,000 back then in the early 80s. It was on its way to Nashville, probably to George Gruen. And at that time in my life, $4,000 may as well have been $400,000. There's no way I could have bought that guitar. Now, the second stellar example of a vintage guitar that I played was a 60 or 61 Stratocaster. It had a slabboard neck, so I know it was an early 60s Stratocaster. And I was working at Bright Music Center, and a customer brought it in, and he had had it refretted somewhere in Pittsburgh and claimed that it no longer played in tune. And it was the same sort of thing. As soon as I strummed that guitar, I knew there was magic there. I couldn't find any tuning issues with the guitar, so he knew I had a gig that night. He said, take the guitar to the gig, play it, and you'll see what I mean that it no longer plays in tune. Well, I took that guitar to every gig for over the next 6 months. It just sounded incredible. Now, the guitar looked like a piece of crap. You talk about relict. Someone had not taken care of it. The pickguard was in pieces. In fact, I kept pieces of the pickguard in the case. I was afraid I would lose them. But the guitar sounded stellar. In fact, the drummer in the band, when we were getting ready for a gig and, you know, you're doodling around on your guitar, he looked at me and said, why are you playing that piece of crap guitar when you have that other beautiful guitar? Now, the beautiful guitar he's referring to is this one. This is a 73 Strat. It was my main instrument at the time. It had been relegated to a backup guitar while I had that early 60s one. So I doodled around on the old piece of crap guitar, and then I put this one on and did the same doodling, and even the drummer in the band said, wow, he could hear the difference. If the drummer in your band can hear the difference, you know there's something special going on with that guitar. Anyway, the guitar was not for sale at any price. I tried, and the gentleman that owned it eventually moved to Texas and took the guitar with him. But that guitar and that 59 Les Paul, in my memory, are the best guitars I ever played, and they were vintage guitars. And they were guitars from the 50s and 60s. And the reason I consider those guitars to be vintage guitars is I've never played a guitar, even from the 70s, that could match some of the instruments I've heard from the 50s and 60s. And I've owned a few. I've owned early 60s Mustangs, Jaguars, an early 60s Coronado, a 1960 Les Paul double cut special TV yellow finish, a 64 Strat, a 53 Blackguard Telecaster. These are guitars I've owned that I played. So yes, there is something special about vintage guitars. Why do vintage guitars sound better than newer guitars? If we could figure that one out, we'd make them. There are some theories. I have my own. One is that the wood that was used to make these guitars back in the 50s and 60s was already a couple hundred years old and very dry. So they had better supplies of wood back in the 50s and 60s before they were making millions of guitars. Another thing, of course, they were much more handmade. There was a lot more attention to detail back in those days before they were mass produced. The finish on most vintage guitars is a lighter nitrocellulose finish versus the poly stuff that we have today. And I think that age does have something to do with it. Age and the fact that they've been played. And I think it's not just the wood that ages, I think the electronics ages as well. I think there's something that happens. I couldn't tell you what, but I just think there's something that happens to the electronics as well. But something definitely does happen. But it has to be more than just age, because as I said before, to me, it's just the 50s and 60s instruments that are so stellar. I've had good guitars from later time periods, but nothing like those guitars. Almost. Now I can count on one hand the number of brand new guitars I've bought over the years. I've almost always bought used guitars rather than new ones. But I have come across the occasional new guitar that sounds stellar. Here's an example. This is a 90 G&L ASAT Special. There was a music store that was going out of business in Pittsburgh. They were having an auction, and I went through their instruments, and they had Fenders and Gibsons and all the good stuff. And they had this oddball there, just this one ASAT. And once again, when I picked it up, strummed a chord, I could hear that it had something special. So I decided to bid on it, figuring nobody else would want to bid on it. Unfortunately, there was one other person there that also heard the magic, so I ended up paying probably full retail price for it anyway. But it was my main guitar for over 10 years. It's a great sounding instrument. It is different than most of the good instruments I've owned that I like, in that it's heavy. It's a boat anchor. Most of the guitars I like are lightweight. This one is heavy, but it is a great sounding and playing instrument. Leo knew what he was doing. The second one that had the same effect on me was this 06 Custom 22 from Paul Reed Smith. Now, there was a lot of buzz about Paul Reed Smith guitars in the 90s, and I had tried a bunch of them, and I thought they were very nice guitars. But nothing really jumped out at me until I was in Guitar Center one day, buying strings or something, and the young salesman there put this guitar in my hands. Okay? And again, as soon as I strummed it, before I even plugged it into an amp, I could tell there was something special about this guitar. I played it for a while. My wife was with me. I told her this is probably the best new guitar I've ever picked up and played. But it was $3,000. Well, I did get a better deal than that. But again, this guitar rivals vintage guitars that I've owned. Is it as good as that 60 Strat that I played? Not even close. Would it stand up to that 59 Les Paul? Not a chance. But it's a good, fine instrument, and it was only like $2,500. So yes, you can find new guitars that do have that vintage thing. Gotta look for them. Well, the question has become almost irrelevant for most of us. If you're looking at Fenders and Gibsons, the prices are just completely out of hand. I've settled for finding good stuff from the 70s and 80s, like this 335, which is an 83. There's no way I could afford to buy a 61 Stratocaster or a 59 Les Paul. So I think that's the boat most of us are in. If I were a multi-millionaire, if I had made good money during my life and I were a guitar player, I would try to find a nice 59 Les Paul. If I made my living playing guitar, if I were good enough that I was making $100,000, $150,000 a year playing guitar every day, I would try to own a 60 Strat or a 59 Les Paul. I'd try to find a way to do that. But I'm a weekend warrior, and that kind of money just doesn't make sense to me. I don't know how long that'll last, that kind of money. But there you go. There's my thoughts on vintage instruments from over the years. Thanks for watching.